Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. We'll be continuing with our 6-part series on family law. So in the last video, we started with the first part of the family law series, and that was on prenuptials. So in this video, we'll be talking today about court marriages in Nigeria. Now, what we refer to as court marriages in Nigeria is actually known as the marriage under the Act. So it's known as statutory marriage because it is a marriage recognized by statutes, and by statutes we mean a written law. By written law, it means a law that has been enacted by the legislature of Nigeria. That's the legislative arm of the government of Nigeria. So that's why it's called a statute. Marriages under this act, and the act specifically is the Marriage Act of Nigeria, which has now been supported by the Matrimonial Causes Act 2 of 1978. So there are basically two laws, but the main law that initiated this form of marriage is the Marriage Act of Nigeria 1914, while the Matrimonial Causes Act also refers to, like, it further elaborates on this marriage under the Marriage Act. So this statutory marriage is what is popularly referred to as court marriage. So the first myth which we are going to bust is the fact that it is referred to as court marriage as though it is celebrated in a court, in a courtroom. But as you will know, for those who know, particularly since it's something that is common, the marriage is not celebrated in a courtroom. Rather, it is celebrated in the marriage registry attached to a local government or in a licensed place of worship. So now, the Act provides that a marriage under that Act, as the statutory marriage, can be conducted either in a registry or in a licensed place of worship. And this is because the Act has provided that if a place of worship approaches the Minister of Interior and applies for the license to conduct marriages in accordance with their religious rights, as long as the basic requirements of the Act are followed, the marriage that is conducted in a licensed place of worship is as good as the one conducted in a marriage registry under the Act. So the Act recognizes both. They are both in pari passu. Some people don't know that their places of worship are licensed, and so they will proceed to the registry to obtain this certificate. And then by the time they now get to their church or their licensed place of worship to conduct the marriage, because they have already obtained the certificate from the registry, it now becomes, the church or licensed place of worship will just conduct the regular rites and just do the normal blessing and all of that, prayers and the rest, because it cannot conduct a second marriage. So what you want to do first of all is to confirm if your place of worship is licensed, and whether they can issue marriages that are as prescribed under the Marriage Act. So we'll now look at who can get married under the Act, because there are qualifications for people to get married under the Act. The very first requirement is that you are single or you are widowed because your spouse has died, which has now made you single again, or you have been divorced legally. This gives the understanding that a marriage under the Act is monogamous in nature. So for you to be qualified to get married under the Act, you have to be single. The second requirement is that you must be of marriageable age. And under the Act, the Marriage Act, the marriageable age is 21 years. So if you are not up to 21 years, you cannot get married under the Act, except if you now obtain a written consent from your parents or your guardian. And under the Act provides that it's the father of the person that is underage that will give that consent. But if the father is not in Nigeria or the father is not alive, the mother can now give that consent. If the mother too is not in Nigeria or is not alive, a legal guardian can give the consent. And then in rare cases, in extreme cases, you cannot even obtain the consent from the governor of the state. You can obtain the consent from a judge of a high court. So those are other extreme cases. So you must be of a marriageable age. Otherwise, the marriage will be considered void. This is by virtue of the provisions of the Matrimonial Causes Act. The third requirement and qualification for you to be married under the Act is that you are not within the prohibited degrees of affinity and consanguinity or kindred, as the two acts have stated. This requirement basically relates to close relationships either by blood, that is consanguinity or kindred, and by marriage on the other hand, and that is what is referred to as affinity. So there are prohibited degrees of consanguinity and affinity. And the Matrimonial Causes Act, in the shadow to the Matrimonial Causes Act, it clearly stated the degrees that are prohibited. So for instance, with respect to affinity, that's by marriage, you cannot be married to your wife or your husband's other child. That is in a case where your wife or your husband has a child other than by you yourself. You're not the mother or father of the child. So you can't get married to your wife's other child. You can't get married to your husband's other child. You can't get married to your wife or your husband's mother or father, depending on if you're a man or a woman. You can't get married to your wife's mother, grandmother, daughter, granddaughter, or grandson, your husband's child, your husband's father, your husband's grandfather, or your husband's grandchildren. So these are the prohibited degrees by marriage. So with respect to affinity, your own blood relatives, of course, you can't get married to your father's sister, your father's brother, or your mother's sister, your mother's brother. That is your parents' direct siblings. Neither can you get married to your own brother or sister's children. Those are your nephews and your nieces. Can't get married within that close range. This applies to whether they are siblings of full blood or half blood. So they don't have to be your full siblings, same parents. As long as they are related, they are your siblings by one parent. This applies to them. You can't get married to your siblings' children, your nephews and your nieces. These are the prohibited degrees of affinity and consanguinity. This is one of the requirements before you can get married under the Act. Like I said earlier, places where this statutory marriage can be conducted are either in a marriage registry, usually attached to a local government in Nigeria, or a licensed place of worship. And by virtue of the Marriage Act, these marriages, if it is in a marriage registry, it must be conducted within the hours of 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. for it to not affect the validity of the marriage. It can be a grounds to challenge the validity of the marriage, and it must be done in an open, it's open doors. So it's not something that is done in camera. It's not hidden. It has to be open to the public. It must be in the presence of at least 2 witnesses, apart from the registrar that is doing the joining. While for a marriage that is conducted in a licensed place of worship, it can be done within the hours of 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And again, too, it has to be done in open doors, and it should have to be open to the public in the presence of 2 witnesses. Follow to comply with these provisions, there are penalties attached to the person conducting the marriage. These are little things that need to be complied with, else it can also affect people that want to raise objections and all of that. So you want to, as much as possible, fall within the provisions of the law so that you don't have anything to worry about. So other requirements with respect to conducting marriages under the Act are that, one, you have to be resident within the locality where you want the marriage to be conducted. You have to be resident within that locality for about 15 days prior to when the 21-day notice will expire. The second requirement following this is that you have to publish a 21-day notice. This notice has to be published by the registry and by the licensed place of worship, notifying the public of the intention of the 2 parties to get married. The registrar of the marriage, or the registrar of marriages, or the the minister of the licensed place of worship will have to be satisfied that you have complied with the law, because there's a form to fill, which is like an affidavit, that states that you have complied with all the requirements, and those requirements are that you have not been married before, that you are still single, and that you're within the marriageable age, or if you're not within the marriageable age, you have obtained consent. We'll further talk about consent, because consent again has other variations. Now, we'll note that with respect to consent, even as much as you're an adult, even though you don't need the consent of your parents, or you don't need any consent based on age, another consent that is required is your own personal consent. That is, you are not deceived, you are not under any form of deceit, or you are not under form of duress. So if one party, the other party to the marriage, if it is found subsequently that you entered into that marriage based on some misrepresentation or mistaken identity or some duress, it is a ground on which the marriage can be dissolved, and we'll talk about that in a separate video. That will be the third part in this series. So consent also has to be willingly given. So at this point now, we'll talk about the major benefits of having a statutory marriage, and to go into this, we'll establish the fact that this same marriage act recognizes other types of marriages, the customary marriages, and it also recognizes Islamic marriages. This is a myth that will also be busting in this video, that all other forms of marriages are legal and binding as long as Nigerian laws in general are concerned. So going away from this video, you should take note that if you have a traditional wedding, that you are legally married. In the eyes of the law, you are legally married. The only difference is that you are not married under the statutes. So it's not a statutory marriage. But it's a legally recognized form of marriage in Nigeria. But the advantage that you have with statutory marriage is that they are recognized internationally. So even if you conduct a statutory marriage in another country, probably because one of the parties, of course, is a citizen of the other country or resident in another country, is acceptable and is valid in Nigeria, and it's at par with the statutory marriage in Nigeria. So the statutory marriage has an international backing, and it's at par with statutory marriages all over the world. So another benefit of statutory marriages is that they are monogamous in nature. Like I said at the beginning of the video, one of the requirements for you to be qualified to have a statutory marriage is that you are not married at all. Or if you are married before, you have a divorce certificate, means that you have formally ended that marriage, so you are still single. Or your spouse is late, your spouse has died, and you have the death certificate to prove it, so which makes you single again. So this is a quality of statutory marriages that makes it more beneficial and amiable to people, because it is deeply rooted in monogamy. Now, at this point, it is now important to explain this issue of monogamy with respect to statutory marriages. And like I said earlier, we'll talk about the implication of the customary marriages in Nigeria or Islamic marriages. So the Marriage Act in Section 35 acknowledges the validity of customary marriages, because it clearly stated that nothing in the act shall affect the validity of any marriage that has been conducted under the customary laws. So this shows that the validity of customary laws is not hindered or hampered by the Marriage Act. So the validity of customary laws is sacrosanct. However, in the earlier part of that Section 35 and in Section 33 of the same Marriage Act, it is illegal for you to be married under customary law to somebody and then be married under the act to another person. This means that because the Marriage Act has recognized the validity of customary marriages, so you can now be married under your native law and customs to somebody else, and then at the same time seek to be married under the act. Like I said, the marriage under customary law is valid in Nigeria and is a binding marriage. So if the act recognizes a marriage under the customs as valid, you can now be married validly under customs to somebody else and then now seek to be married under the act to another person, because both marriages are valid. Now this is also another important myth that will be busting in this video, because people think that if they are married to somebody under the customary law, they can validly get married to another person under the act, or vice versa. No, that's not what the act says. The act actually says, and in fact prescribes, a punishment for you if you get married to somebody under customary law and then proceed to take another one under the act, or vice versa. Under the Marriage Act, the provision for the person who does, the people who do it, is 5 years imprisonment, except if the person that's been married in for the second time doesn't know that the spouse already was married to another person. It is not the person's fault. This provision or penalty will not apply to her, because the party has to know, the woman has to know that the husband that she married or intends to get married to has been married before. So, but for the man who now, of course, who knows that he was married before and goes ahead to protract another marriage, the person is liable to have committed an offense for which he will be liable for a term of 5 years imprisonment under the Marriage Act. However, under the Criminal Code of Nigeria, which is the body of laws that codifies all criminal matters, this same offense is known as bigamy. That is, you are being married to 2 people at the same time under the act. And in fact, in that section 370, the law provides that it's a felony for it, and you'll be liable for a term of 7 years. So even the Marriage Act provides for 5 years, while under the Criminal Code Act, it's a term of 7 years. So it depends on which law that the person that is bringing the case prosecutes you under. But I'll also add at this point that this offense of bigamy is hardly legislated on in the Nigerian courts. And the reason is not far-fetched. It is because our society is traditionally a polygamous society. So before we embrace the English laws and colonialism and the rest of that, our society was basically a polygamous society. So this is the interface between the different types of marriages, particularly in this case, statutory marriage as opposed to customary and Islamic marriages. So you can see how they interplay and how everything works out. So now this takes us to the last part of this video. We can now safely conclude that the issue of the monogamous nature of statutory marriages is one of the major hallmarks of statutory marriages. Closely related to this issue of the monogamous nature of statutory marriage is the certainty that statutory marriages provide, because you know how exactly everything works. And in the case of a dissolution of the marriage, you know the procedures to take. So unlike the customary marriages and Islamic marriages, which are easier to dissolve, another major benefit of statutory marriages is that they are not easy to dissolve. Although this can work as a benefit and also work as a hindrance, depending on which side of the coin you are. So they are not easily dissolvable, because there's a whole lot of procedures to be followed before the marriage can be dissolved, and it can only be dissolved by a court of law. And I guess probably that's where it's called court marriage. This statutory marriage is seen as a marriage in which you willingly go into by yourself, but you cannot pull out just by yourself. You must go through the courts as far as Nigerian law is concerned. And all this is provided for particularly in the Matrimonial Causes Act, because the Matrimonial Causes Act now provides for the steps and qualifications, everything, the whole gamut of the solution of marriages. So that will be what we'll talk about in the third part of this family law series. We'll be talking specifically about divorce, and we'll talk about the entire process in the third part of this video. So at this point, we will just note, while concluding this video on court marriages, that the fact that this statutory marriage provides for certainty and clarity. So you have something that regulates and governs the union. So they cannot just do anything they want to do that is not within the provisions of the law. So this is where we'll be drawing the curtain for this video, and I hope you got value for it. Kindly indicate in the comment section below if a statutory marriage is worth it based on the pros and cons of a statutory marriage, or whether you prefer to just stick with the customary marriage, and your reasons. Also do well to subscribe to the channel so that you get further updates as we upload more videos. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next video. Bye.